It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Marina Walker-Guevara. As Deputy Director of the ICIJ, she managed two of the largest collaborative investigative journalism projects in history, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. Over her 20-year career, she has investigated environmental degradation by mining companies, the illicit tobacco trade, and the criminal networks depleting the world's oceans, just in case we run out of things to talk about. Marina has won over 40 national and international journalism awards for her work, including the Pulitzer Prize for Exploratory Reporting. We are thrilled to have her with us this evening to discuss her latest project, the Paradise Papers. Marina, by way of context, let's just review a few points about the Panama and Paradise Papers so we're all sort of level set here. Panama Papers were released in April 2016, consisting of approximately 11.5 million files, 2.6 terabytes of data, consisting almost entirely of personal financial information from the Panamanian law firm of Mossack Fonseca. The release, which came after more than a year of unprecedented secret cooperation between some 400 journalists in 80 countries, depicted the inner workings of an invisible global economy of politicians, business people, money launderers, criminals, and the people who abet them. There followed some 4,700 stories about the dealings in illegal but legal, but rather embarrassing incidents, the resignations of the Prime Minister of Iceland, and the removal of the Prime Minister of Pakistan, numerous arrests for tax evasion, and the exposure of some 70 heads of state, prime ministers, and their family members. It is easier to name the countries who did not have some member of their elite in the Panama Papers than those that do. That bombshell was followed last November by the so-called Paradise Papers, this time 13.4 million records in a more petite 1.4 terabytes of data. Of some 25,000 entities over 6 decades in 30 offshore jurisdictions, primarily in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. 380 journalists cooperated on this release. Caught up in the data were both the Queen of England and Prince Charles, the President of Colombia, and the American Secretary of Commerce. There were 120 politicians involved, dealings in 37 countries. Another wrinkle of the Paradise Papers, which was largely concerned with tax schemes, were the tax avoidance strategies of companies including Apple, Nike, and Uber. As was the case with the Panama Papers, much of the activity released was legal. But clearly, many of the wealthy clients, politicians, and corporations did not welcome these acts of radical data transparency. And many more global elites, looking at ICIJ's searchable database of these records, must wonder what will come out next. So Marina, let me begin by asking the obvious. Aside from stay tuned, what can you tell us remains to be published by either of those troves?
Well, I would say that these leaks and these large troves of secret data are like Pandora boxes. And as long as there are committed and tenacious journalists who are asking the right questions, as long as there are political scandals that are giving out more names and more connections, we are on the job, and we are going to be seeing stories from both the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers in the US and around the world. We're also doing a lot of crowdsourcing. So we have published a database of more than 500,000 offshore entities that were secret before, that nobody knew they existed, nobody knew who was connected to them, and now they are public. You can search them. You can search for people you know. You can search for the powerful, and that is being very active at this time. We are also doing a small projects with local reporters. For example, on the Paradise Papers, we're doing a project called Alma Mater. And this project looks at 100 universities and colleges, mostly here in the US, that also took advantage of the secrecy of tax havens. And you might be thinking, well, they don't pay taxes anyway, right? They are nonprofits. It turns out that when they behave like hedge funds, and that's how they raise their endowments, they do have to pay a little tax. And they have found a way, many of them, to avoid it, doing these complicated structures in tax havens. So we are recruiting local reporters to probe these universities and to bring to light how this money is being raised, and if it translates or not to improvements for students, for faculty, for the university at large, for scholarships.
short version, there's still a lot of material out there.
Yes.
Okay. As I think about this, there are two areas that are both very rich. One is the material itself and what it means and what we're finding from this and what else we might see from this. And the other is this new type of journalism you're engaged in with these large groups from many different organizations cooperating in a kind of cybersphere of data, leakers, cooperatives. Let's address the first part. What do you think these documents are telling us about the world we live in?
These documents are illuminating the huge disparity between the 1%, or as you said before in our meeting, they are this super class of elites that are either writing the laws and then avoiding those laws altogether, or they are going through secret havens to just enjoy secrecy, to enjoy almost a complete lack of oversight on their affairs. And sometimes it's because they don't want to pay taxes that we all pay, but sometimes it's just because they want to be associated to people that they don't want us to know that they are associated. One of the stories that we wrote about in the Paradise Papers was about our Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. And his story, yes, it could be the tax avoidance aspect of running his business through the Cayman Islands. But it was all, for us, the most interesting story was that following that change of secrecy and layers of offshore companies, you get all the way to a very lucrative millions of dollars worth relationship with Russian individuals that are part of the inner circle of Vladimir Putin. In today's context, that is a much more important story. And that is a story that would have never come to light had it not been for this confidential leak that we were able to obtain and then go to the public record and see, how that story may or may not have been reflected there. It wasn't there in all of its dimensions.
These are things we suspected. And in some ways, it's a hallmark of history that the wealthy and the politically powerful will control much of how large groups of people live. But in the last 30 years, with the fall of communism, with global financial markets, with hyperspeed computation, we seem to have moved into a kind of supercharged international class that can move very comfortably around the world and at times writes laws and at times avoids laws, and that money and power and sometimes even electoral office are very hard to distinguish one from another. And what struck me about this was reading these documents was like being taken down into the engine room. Yeah? Exactly.
It's like the mechanics of how the richer become richer, and then everybody else is stuck with the laws and regulations. It's really important to understand that when we look at our economy, we think we understand the economy. We think that the economy is the treasury, is Wall Street, the stock exchange, our savings accounts. And then realizing, being able to look into this secret world and realizing that that is the economy. And that this economy is happening completely out of sight, out of mind, away from scrutiny. So how dangerous is that, not only for the economy, but for our democracy?
Are you saying it actually dwarfs Wall Street itself? I find that a little hard to believe.
I don't know if it dwarfs, but some, these calculations are usually tricky, but some economists have said that about a third of the world economy today goes through tax havens.
Really?
Nobody knows really, because why? Unless we get these giant leaks, it's really hard to know. In these tax havens, and by the way, it's important to understand that they are not just Caribbean islands. There are sometimes there are tax haven pockets in countries like the United States. For example, Wyoming or Delaware are tax havens. And in these places, and in the Caribbean islands, it is a crime that can be punished by jail to disclose who owns a company. So there are really draconian laws that protect these world leaders, politicians, and the world's most iconic companies from doing, from ever being revealed that they had business.
It's
there.
a fascinating snapshot, and it sounds almost cynical, but it's interesting to ask, why should citizens care? Do you think people have been empowered by this knowledge?
We think that people have been empowered by this knowledge. Until we have been publishing about this, the secret offshore economy for several years now. And at the beginning, people, I think, didn't see the connection with their personal lives. And what the Panama Papers and now the Paradise Papers helped was they help people understand that they are the victims in the story. When they are like, who's the victim? We always want to know in investigative journalism who's suffering, who's getting damaged here. And it's all of us. It's anybody who's just doing the right thing.
Because our leaders are indirectly in legion with arms dealers, or because taxes are being withheld that could go to our common good? What strikes you
For
in this?
all of the above. Because we are allowing one special class of citizens to conduct their lives and their business through a special set of rules that we know nothing about, and then the rest of us have to follow the other rules.
You've had
taxes.
You've had a long and rich, successful career in journalism. You had intimations all this was going on. What has surprised you the most in looking at this material?
It probably shouldn't surprise me, but it surprises me to find so many politicians involved in these kind of transactions from all political partners, political parties. In this case, we've found a lot of really progressive politicians.
The Prime Minister of Iceland, I think everyone stepped back at that.
And and the right hand and the main fundraiser of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Mm-hmm. This is the person that brought Justin Trudeau to power. Is his buddy, his friend. They are like this, and this is a person that for 20 years has been sending money offshore, and not only that, also lobbying in Canada to avoid, to deregulate and to make sure that nobody gets caught when doing business offshore.
Well, are tax havens universally a bad thing in your view? This is a legal entity. Yeah. People have a right to conduct these businesses.
A lot of economists have analyzed this, and they believe that there is really no real economic advantage to tax havens, that the damage they create by attracting criminals, by enabling money laundering and large-scale or industrial-scale tax avoidance completely outweighs any economic benefit that they may have for a super tiny small of people who claim, perhaps legitimately, that they need privacy in their affairs because they have a family conflict or something. They really need to make sure that they protect their money. The bad stuff that happens and the bad people that are attracted by this promise of secrecy completely outweighs any potential benefit of tax havens.
And then, of course, a whole other dimension which bears much discussion in the case of the Paradise Papers was this kind of industrial scale tax avoidance. But here again, Ireland goes out of its way to publicize how tax-friendly it will be to corporations. And many Valley companies, including Google, have taken advantage of this. Exactly. They are offered this and they keep cash there, and it's a lot of cash. Yeah. What was discovered in Panama that was any different from what was publicly available?
What we discovered, well, in Paradise Papers, we had information about like 100 multinational companies, and it's not publicly available. They don't go telling the world that they are doing these things often.
I saw Apple.
Apple, for example,
Twitter
had to testify
Nike.
In the U.S. Senate. Mm. Yes. Testify in the U.S. Senate in 2013 about the aggressive tax avoidance structures in Ireland. And they, at that time, the CEO of Apple said, "We assure you, senators, that we are not using little Caribbean islands, and we are going to correct this, and we are not avoiding." And sure enough, the Paradise Papers show, and you can read the story, that just a few months after saying that, Apple goes and uses Appleby, which is the law firm at the heart of the Paradise Papers, and starts shopping around for what? A Caribbean island. They didn't find the Caribbean island, but they ended up settling for Jersey in the English Channel, and then eventually ended it back in Ireland. 260 billion is what is sitting abroad, just in profits that Apple has kept overseas. And now with the tax reform in the US, of course, we are rewarding anybody who has avoided taxes, who has shifted these profits abroad. They can bring it back just at a 14% tax. Mm-hmm. So anybody who did the right thing had to pay the full bill, and anybody who did these aggressive structures and left us without the benefit of those tax dollars, those tax dollars for schools, for roads, for police. That's what tax pays for, right? It's the basic contract of our society. Mm. Those people who avoided that are now being compensated, are being rewarded.
So you don't think anything that's been publicized in the last 10 weeks will slow down or change corporate behavior?
It's very hard. It's very hard because, you know why? Because it's so mainstream. When you have leaders and countries and the biggest companies that own our economy, and they are all part of this, and they all want to normalize it. That's what Gary Cohn, President Trump's chief economic advisor, said of the Paradise Papers, which, by the way, featured him and his former employer, Goldman Sachs, was like, this is the way the world works. Of course, yeah. So that's what they want us.
Who knows how the engine room
goes?
Don't
probe it. They are like, don't probe it, don't push it. It's like the sexual harassment thing, right? Like, don't make us uncomfortable. This is the way it has been, and it should be okay.
And that's the issue. Don't make us uncomfortable by providing a diagram for how it works.
Yeah.
There's something wrong in that sentence. What's wrong with the transparency? If you're so comfortable with it, on the right and the left. Which is, David Cameron, conservative prime minister. Mm-hmm. But also, I thought Renaissance Technologies was so interesting. James Simons, but also Robert Mercer.
Incredible.
One backs Democrats, the other backs Republicans.
So James Simons is one of the biggest Democratic donors, and he is the head with Mercer of Renaissance Technologies, this hedge fund. The single biggest pot of money we found in the Paradise Papers sitting in Bermuda belonged to James Simons. And $7.3 billion in a Bermuda trust that he blames some Brazilian friend for starting 30 years ago, and then things like,
you all know how that goes, right?
Yeah. And then apparently the Bermuda Trust then turned into a foundation, which constitute one of if that foundation was here in the US, it would be one of the top 10 foundations. Imagine how much good that money could do here in the US. But instead, the money is stuck in Bermuda. Now, if he brings it back, he would have to pay a lot of taxes, although we would have to see with this tax reform, maybe he doesn't have to pay any taxes. So we would have to look into that.
You did seem to do quite a bit of work on the current administration. Do you think it is very different from previous ones, Obama, Bush, Clinton, and anyone in their time?
Because the administration is staffed with businessmen, and I think it's not that surprising that they are all featured in these papers, that they all had tax haven holdings, and that they all want us to think that is normal and that we shouldn't make them uncomfortable asking the questions.
Yes, it is normal.
But the Democrats think the
same
in many cases, because when we went to James Simons again and asked the questions, he didn't provide any progressive, thoughtful, soul-searching answer to the questions. And I remember a young reporter, a young and aggressive reporter in our team was doing that question, and he was kind of like in his idealism, disappointed. He thought he was going to get a different response, but he didn't.
History. powerful people, right? But at a scale we've never seen before, and with an ease of moving among borders we've never seen before.
Exactly. It's so in Panama Papers, we saw a lot of criminal concentrated wealth. And what we see in Paradise Papers is all kinds of concentrated wealth at a level we had never seen before. And at a time where inequality is as deep as we have probably ever experienced it. So that's the scary part of this whole story. And that's where we are all victims and where we all should care. And that's what is so valuable, what the citizens of Iceland did when they went out in the street and they told their prime minister, enough. We are not tolerating this. We're not tolerating this lack of transparency, this incoherence, this conflict of interests, and you have to go. And off he went.
Now, it must be an enormous public event for you when this comes out. It must also be very hard to sit on this information for a year. You get a release like this and you just think, this is going to be an earthquake in 14 months.
Exactly.
Oh my God. So I have to ask, I started by saying, do you have more to come? And you said there's other bombshells inside this. Are there other releases?
What do you mean, like other big stories?
You've done 6 of these now, right? These
you
are
mean
the two most visible.
Yes.
Yeah. When you do this, your organization becomes famous. Are you contacted by other leakers?
We are lucky that whistleblowers like ICIJ and our partners, because it's efficient for them. They come to one place, they leak to one place, but the story is published simultaneously everywhere. So it's maximum impact. They see that things happen, because when you can leverage the resources of, and I say this humbly, of 110 media organizations of all sizes and backgrounds from around the world, that's a pretty powerful thing to do.
We were characterizing these wealthy people as transnational people working at an unprecedented scale. That's also what this journalism is.
We need to match those peoples, and that's why we're working the way we're working. We are not working as a transnational global newsroom because we like the trouble of having to communicate in 20 different languages and sharing documents and data across borders and figuring out the technology and the encryption. We're doing it because otherwise we're dead, because otherwise those public interest stories are never going to come out. Everybody
has to work on this level now in some sense.
Organized crime figured it how many years ago? Like 50? And journalists are still, until very recently, we were working in isolation. That is our DNA. If we can, we will still do it. I can, bet that our instinct is to scoop, is to go alone, is to be the star. And we're trying to defeat that concept at ICIJ. We want all the lone wolf investigative reporters of the world to unite, to get organized, to coordinate among themselves, and to take the world by storm on issues that really matter.
I want to spend a few minutes on the mechanics in just a moment, but first I wanted to ask, if you had a wish list, what would you most like to receive? What's a document trove you'd love to see?
Oh my God, North Korea.
Well, I was going to go there, actually.
Facebook.
We get finance, we get
Twitter.
Facebook.
We did have Facebook and Twitter traces of really interesting stories in the Paradise Papers about how the Russian state had funded Facebook and Twitter through billionaire entrepreneurs, but nonetheless it was money that was coming from state-owned banks. And again, was that illegal? No, it wasn't illegal, but it also wasn't known. It was information that Facebook and Twitter or the billionaire entrepreneur or the state of Russia had not disclosed to the public.
Right.
So it takes this kind of...
That was a Russian investor here, Yuri Milner, who was in Facebook ahead of the IPO. And he did not disclose his investors, but I don't know any big private equity or VC guy who discloses all his investors to you.
What we think is important is that, again, in the current environment, and it's all about context. So maybe that story, I agree, 6 years ago didn't matter, but today it matters that Facebook and Twitter had Russian state money as that they were also seed investors.
And the wealth of Putin and the wealth of Putin and his circle is a major story that is not well understood.
Yeah, and it's one that both the Panama and the Paradise Papers in different ways help illuminate. The Panama Papers help us trace $2 billion to Putin's inner circle and to show, as you would say, the structure, the mechanics of how it works, how that money gets stripped from public or state companies. It travels all around the world. It goes through the financial system that we all know and love, and it goes back to his friends and, his most immediate circle.
But you raise an interesting and somewhat troubling question here, because if you look at the big leaks, WikiLeaks, Snowden, Paradise and Panama, they're Western institutions. And it happens in part because we do believe in a freer flow of information, and we've established systems of communication that yield to this being taken care of. And you're not seeing systemic crime and corruption from totalitarian states, pick your favorites, in anything like this. So in this world of high-scale, high-velocity transnationalism, is the West somewhat disadvantaging itself by being transparent? Or do you think that the totalitarian states will also be exposed?
I don't know that the Western world is being transparent. Like, we wouldn't know half of these things if it wasn't for the leaks. So,
okay, half transparent, though. But that's 50% compared to nothing from the totalitarian states.
Well, yeah, but that's such a low standard. So I don't want to compare to that standard to Kazakhstan. Like, I think we can be better than Kazakhstan. Why
can't we be more like Angola?
Exactly.
It's not really great.
So the problem is, as you said before, is that it's the banks and it's the financial institutions that basically have and they're now trying with these leaks to get a little better, because they have realized that it's really bad PR, but they kind of gave up on their gatekeeping duties. And they started opening bank accounts for anybody without checking, without doing, like, I get more background checks, as a foreigner here in the US when I try to open a bank account than some of these, like a billionaire from Greece would get in London or in the Marshall Islands, or, So that is, we saw it with the HSBC investigation, which was a previous leak, in which the bank HSBC had colluded with all kinds of criminals and drug dealers from around the world. And they started by denying everything and threatening with an injunction. And 4 or 5 days before publication, they ended up saying in a written statement that 70% of their clients, 70% of their clients should not have been their clients in their first place. And that is like, a very, mainstream bank?
Yeah. Let's move on to the mechanics of some of this and the story of the leak, and then the mechanics of how you take apart a project this big. Panama came from John Doe, not his real name, or her real name. Or their real name, for all we know, who contacted a German newspaper with the question, are you interested in data? Take it from there. What happened?
So thankfully, the German reporters replied immediately, yes, we are. And so went the conversation. The next question was what kind of data, how much data? John Doe said, more data than you have ever seen. Why are you doing this? And John Doe said, because I have seen so much criminality and so much that is causing inequality around the world, and I just can't stand it anymore, and you are my last hope, basically, journalists. John Doe also had tried to leak to other media organizations and had not gotten a response, because people sometimes ask why a German newspaper that we have never heard of. And now they have been the recipients of not just the Panama Papers, but then later the Paradise Papers.
Made a name for themselves. And he turned out to be something of an interesting character. I'll just stay with he because he calls himself John, saying, my life is in danger
Yes.
and then releasing a manifesto saying I'm motivated by income inequality and justice, and a very eloquent statement about this.
He's a good writer. He's a very thoughtful individual, which is fascinating. And I sometimes wonder whether maybe in 40 years from now, when I'm an old lady, I will read in the newspaper that John Doe came out and is this person, you know, just like what happened with Deep Throat, remember, in Watergate.
What protections did you have to provide John Doe?
Often these leakers, especially on this scale, they are well equipped. They sometimes know what they are doing. They are technologically savvy. And I would say that from what our German partners have shared with us, John Doe was this type of person. But in general, with whistleblowers, you have to try to, if you see that they are being reckless or that they don't know how to protect themselves, our duty as journalists is to try to advise a little bit as much as we can. If somebody is contacting you on open email or sending you, and it has happened that people have leaked really sensitive information on open email, and then you try to
cut it out, buddy.
you try to advise a little bit. It's a whole art of keeping the relationship going, and especially think about a John Doe waiting for 14 months on these promises of there's 400 journalists working together, and we're finding all kinds of stories, and they will come out one day, don't worry. And it has never been done before, but it's going to be done this time, and you're going to be okay. It was a lot to believe, and a lot, a big leap of faith for him or her.
And he's gone on to say he would testify in exchange for immunity. Do you know what happened with that?
No, because, again, because of source protection, we don't ask questions. ICIJ is not directly in touch with John Doe. But what John Doe said is that whistleblowers in our time, they don't have the protections that they need. And we have seen them with Snowden, and we have seen them with other cases. They get their lives completely torn apart the minute they become known, their names are public. So he said, I want to help. He said, I don't work for a government, because there were all kinds of conspiracy theories that you might remember. Oh, this comes from the CIA. And they were like, oh, no, this comes from the KGB. Oh, wait, no, Putin is there. It shouldn't come from the KGB. So there were all kinds. And he said, I've never worked for a government, but I want to help prosecutors. I want to help others who are investigating these crimes, but I'm not going to do it until protections are given not only to me, but to all whistleblowers who are risking their lives.
And what do you know about the Paradise Papers leaker?
Absolutely nothing. The Paradise Papers leakers is also an anonymous source, and it also went through Süddeutsche Zeitung, and they don't discuss sources at all, which I think is a really smart thing to do, because that is the one thing you can't share with your network of collaborators. We ask our reporters 100% radical transparency and radical sharing, but the one thing you can't ever ask is that the source be shared, because that would be the end of the source and probably the end of the story. So we take that to heart, and what do? We establish public interest in the data, and we want to make sure that we're first of all looking at legitimate documents, and second, that there's public interest, because they can be legitimate, but they can be about private individuals with like no influence in society or no clear pattern of wrongdoing, and in that case, it wouldn't be a story, right? It wouldn't be proper for journalists to be probing that. So once we establish public interest and knowing that we have been passive recipients of this leaked data, that we haven't participated in any legal activity to obtain the data, as journalists, we can't take part. We can't direct a source. We can't tell a source, oh, can you get a little bit more or more recent from Mossack Fonseca? That would be like, that is the line that you can never cross as a journalist. But as long as you are a passive recipient and you can establish public interest, then I think it's fair game.
Let me go down into your engine room now. You get 13.5 million records. You have hundreds of journalists. How do you then decide who's going to look at what? How many? There's going to be 4,000 stories. Okay, so who's going to do what? You've recruited all these people. How do you make them all march in one line?
So it's a lot of work, but I would say it's like three things. Is trust is the first thing. We have built a network of trust with these reporters from around the world, not over like 2 or 3 years, but over 20 years of existence. And so these are people we know, we trust, and that is super important if you are going to be sharing a sensitive story for over a year. The second one is technology. We are using technology to disrupt the old models of the old media models and the old investigative reporting models. So we use technology both to investigate the documents themselves. So journalists in any country from Burkina Faso, and we actually have worked with journalists there, to the US or China, can have the same access to the totality of the documents and search them like if they were searching in Google. They can write the name of a person or a company or any word, and they would get their results from the 13.5 million records. They can also upload a full list of all their elected officials and match it against the totality of the data. And then the next thing they do, or we provide, is this global newsroom. It's a platform that it looks like, we call it the Facebook of investigative journalism, but I don't want to call it that anymore because I don't want to give free advertising to Facebook. So, but it looks a little bit like that. It used to be cool when I said that before, but it's not cool anymore somehow. It's a wall. It's like a social media wall, and journalists get to connect with their peers in the investigation. They also get to share their findings. So the minute you find your prime minister, the minute you find the biggest businessman in your country, whatever, you immediately share that finding, and then the rest of the team starts collaborating and building on the finding. Somebody might say, oh, great finding, I think I can get the court records for the case that he was involved or she was involved 3 years ago.
So if someone in Belgium spots Wilbur Ross and these Russians, well, that's an American story. Does he cede it to the Americans, or
the person has to share it with everyone, because that's a world story. So now, like, nobody has like American, Belgium. All stories have connections to a lot of countries, and so we share it with the entire team, and then the entire team, we work on it. But of course, the Americans probably would lead that story with input from different people, but the story...
Anybody can hit it. They're making their choices relative to their leadership.
And our partners, they all do their own stories. It's not that we're all trying to write the same draft together across borders. That would be crazy. So our media partners control their stories. We share everything on the reporting and the research process, but then when you write your stories, your story has to have your voice, and, very important, you take legal responsibility for the story. It's not that ICIJ is absorbing anybody's liabilities.
How do you decide which reporters can be in this group?
We do a combination of things. We look for, of course, great reporters who are real diggers, the real deal investigative reporter, the kind of person that would sit for hours and hours in front of a computer or sifting through documents without getting bored. We would also look for team players. So it's not just about being a genius digger. You wanna, if you're going to be playing with these people in secret for 14 months, you want people who are team players, who wanna share, who are collegial. I have a whole like emotional intelligence profile and I look for those things. Yes, I want the journalists who can communicate well. I want journalists who are self-aware. I want, because otherwise it's just too hard.
There's a lot of editors laughing into their beer right now listening to this.
And they
self-aware,
and they, right. You know what? And they laugh, but then when you actually come to these collaborations, they are all really nice. They are really nice. They exist. People who are actually super successful and intelligent and really nice.
Oh, and they must be thrilled to be with peers who have the same kinds of passion to dig.
Yes, exactly.
I understand that. Would you take someone from Xinhua, the Chinese state news agency?
We probably wouldn't, because we don't want to work with
RT, Russia State Television?
No, because those media organizations are heavily controlled and dominated by governments. It's different, for example, from the BBC. The BBC is also funded by a government, but there are firewalls, and the British government, does not have any input into what gets covered in the BBC, and that's not the case with RT or with Xinhua. So yes, so we wouldn't, but we work with a range of organizations of different size and background. Sometimes like really small, gutsy, investigative little outlets in Africa. In Tunisia, we work with a group called Intifada, and their whole website was hacked after Panama Papers in retaliation. They came out of that. It's the collaborations are great equalizers. Everybody's equal. The New York Times is equal and has the same rights and the same access than the smallest little outfit in Latin America, in Chile, in any country.
Now, with Paradise Papers, that was the 6th project that ICIJ has done, right?
The 6th project on financial secrecy.
Large-scale database
yes,
operations. In how long a period?
I would say in 6 years. We've done one per year in the past 6 years, but we've done dozens of projects over our entire existence, of course, and many of them based on public data.
And we've seen precursors to this, large-scale things like, there was, in the Bush era, the firings of the state attorneys general, ClimateGate in 2009, where a bunch of emails were hacked owing to climate scientists and discrediting climate change in apparently selective ways. Snowden, we mentioned, WikiLeaks. Is this evolving? Is large-scale data dumps becoming a kind of standard in the world, and will it continue?
The information is available now in ways that it wasn't available when Deep Throat was talking in a parking garage with Bob Woodward. And so the information is there, is available, and as we have seen, is not being kept that securely. So yes, there are more whistleblowers that have this information available to their fingertips and that are willing to share it. And it's very encouraging that instead of dumping the whole thing in the internet, which they could do, they are instead coming to investigative reporters. I think that is a really good and powerful statement, and one that we should take as journalists very seriously. And I used to tell my Panama and Paradise Papers teams, beyond everything, we here have a responsibility to show that this model works and that people can trust the media and that people can trust investigative reporters. So let's please not screw it up.
Well, it's an interesting issue, and I very purposely mentioned, high-quality data dumps and sketchy quality data dumps.
Yeah.
In some cases.
And be able to recognize the difference.
How can you tell the difference? And how much are you worried about the data dump equivalent of what James O'Keefe tried to do to discredit the Washington Post, planting a false person with a false story in a mainstream news organization in the hopes they'll take the bait and then he can prove their,
well, that is
immoral
like
people.
Outrageous deceit, and I just don't think there's any comparison. That's
no, but what if, as you say, and what if someone were to plant 20 or 30 files among 10,000?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and that's sometimes that keeps us up at night. Sometimes we wake up at like 3 in the morning. I'm like, what if there's one, not even 20, one?
Yeah, this is all about destroying one person.
So we have really strict fact-checking processes, and when we work in these investigations, it's not like you get these files magically in your lap and there's a story. That's why it takes us 14 months. It takes us 14 months because we are checking every probing and checking and fact-checking, and also making the secret data, the confidential data, talk to the real world. Because the secret data talks about connections and people and companies and lawsuits that then you can go and see if they exist in the real world. And if they don't exist in the real world, then, well, that's a sign that maybe you need to look a little bit further into it. So we just the rigor of the investigative reporting process is more important now than ever. And we have seen a few retractions and sad situations recently in the media where, because reporters are rushing to scoop others, to get traffic, they are messing up. And when they mess up, they don't just mess up for themselves, they mess up for the entire sector, and they erode even more the trust that some citizens have in the media. So we rather take 14 months and spend more money in fact checkers. Our stories, each fact has to be footnoted, and there's an independent fact checker that is probing every fact in every story we put out. And that's the only way to go about it. And of course, giving people time to respond. We take a lot of risk in going to people really early. Like sometimes we give them 4 weeks. All these corporations and individuals had weeks to respond to our stories before they came out. Some of them took advantage of that and either put a lot of pressure on the journalists or leaked part of the stories to friendly outlets. But we rather that happens than not being rigorous and then being sorry and affecting the rest of the profession and our colleagues.
That is to say, so 13 million files is just the start. Then you triangulate it against known behaviors, other things you can find in the world.
Exactly.
It has to concatenate exactly with what the data is saying.
You have to do the traditional investigative reporting.
The shoe leather comes out.
Exactly. Shoe leather is technology and shoe leather. And the two go together. And if you just do one or the other, you're going to miss part of the story.
We have some questions from the audience, a number of which concern our president. Are you finding anything on Donald Trump and his associates other than Wilbur Ross? Another similar question. Why don't we start with that one?
Well, you can go to our website. We did a whole interactive about 13 cabinet members, donors, and friends of Trump and supporters of Trump, including Adelson, including Sheldon Adelson, Steve Schwarzman, Steve Wing from Wing Resorts, who was Gary Cohn, we mentioned him before. Of course, the Koch brothers, they've been...
As I recall, it's about 10 faces surrounding the president.
I think there's actually 13 counting Wilbur Ross. So you can explore...
And the Koch brothers only got one circle, so...
Well, but the Koch brothers, actually, they also came out in our Luxembourg project. They've been running their business offshore for a long time, so... Yeah, it wasn't surprising.
Busy guys. Robert Mueller is considering charging Trump with collaborating with WikiLeaks to receive an in-kind benefit. Is this a threat to your style of journalism? I'm not really sure because you're not connected to any political figure.
Yes.
No. Okay. Is there evidence that countries with lower tax rates experience less tax avoidance through offshore companies? This argument is put forward to support the current tax bill before the U.S. Congress.
No, actually, there's very little evidence. Like if you are going to avoid taxes, and we have seen it before with these tax holidays, when in 2004, again, we allowed corporations to bring back their money at a very low rate, and we thought maybe that will change their behavior. They will also create jobs, and nothing of that happened. They didn't create jobs, and they continued avoiding taxes everywhere they could, not only in the US, but also they avoid taxes in other European countries and in other countries around the world that have lower taxes in some cases than the US has, and they still avoid the taxes there. It's just about a mentality and a pattern of behavior. Their CEOs get bonuses and get one of the criteria is how much tax they were able to avoid or save.
There is a sociology to these things. Like, it's not that the CEO is calling up Mossack Fonseca or Appleby. They've got this armada of tax lawyers.
Yeah.
And okay, the rate's gone from 30% to 20%. My job is to try and save tax money.
Exactly.
Like, my job hasn't changed at all, so I'm calling up Applebee's again.
Yeah, they get rewarded for slashing taxes. It's a systemic corporate
structure. So that will continue, right?
That will continue until we make or not we, but those who have the power to do it, turn what is legal today, turn it to illegal. And the head of tax at the European Commission said it in a hearing a couple of weeks ago. He said, well, if this is so scandalous and so outrageous and is so legal, then let's make it illegal. Wasn't slavery legal at one time? And then it wasn't anymore.
We have a question about the news cycle. And I must ask you about the psychology internally for you when, as you go through 14 months and you get closer and closer to it and you see how many stories are going to launch, what's that like?
It's still like every time that it happens, we are just like, this is kind of like a miracle. Like we can't believe how it's all coming together, and it's really nerve-wracking, because you trust your network and you trust your reporters, but there's always new people we are adding. The reporters, yes, they are trusted reporters, but they are bringing their teams. Like the BBC had like 30 people working on Paradise Papers. I don't know the 30 people. I just know the guy who's running them, and I trust him, and I know he's running a good show. But it's a lot of adrenaline, but it's also very humbling, is to see journalism being transformed. So not only we're trying to change the world, but we're trying to change journalism. And as a journalist, I love that. I love to see the collegiality. Reporters like to, believe it or not, to rise above the politics of their newsrooms, the politics of their countries, the constraints in which, the financial constraints of their newsrooms. And here they kind of like get to live, in a supra, global newsroom that is tackling a story of global importance, and they don't get to do that every day.
Now, if it's a single news organization, there will be a plan for a rollout. This is the wildest information, we'll release it first, or this is the tentpole story and everything else will be reflected from that, or this is the maximum time to release this right now, we have to go. Do you control anything having to do with the news cycle, or you just say, at midnight, y'all can launch?
Well, we do set a publication date, and of course that's kind of an interesting process. We try to make it democratic, but it's not really that democratic. So we get everybody to say when is a good time to publish, and of course it's all different in every reporter would say a different time and date, and so then ICIJ makes a decision for everyone, and they're very good at respecting it, and we try to benefit the most media organizations as we can. And we do have a publication rollout, believe it or not. What we do is we look at what are the biggest stories in each leak. And so, for example, in this case, it was the political story and the Trump-related stories, the Wilbur Ross stories. Those had to go on day one. I think it was important that we led with what is on people's minds. But then the multinational story was also really important one, so we went with that like right after on day two. And so we try to organize the rollout in a way that makes sense, but then, you have things like, the British were saying, well, but we don't want to publish the Queen on day one. And we're like, the Queen is the Queen. The Queen has to be in day one. The Queen is the lead. You can't hide the Queen of England.
Queen on day 3 is going to be kind of weird.
But
oh, yeah, the Queen.
But the British are really pushing and aggressive, so they got us to agree to not release Prince Charles until day 3.
Notice.
So it was the Queen on. So the agreement was, okay, fine. The Queen on day 1 and Prince Charles can wait until day 3, and that was okay. So we have a little bit of that. And it's kind of fun.
Do you think you delayed the marriage announcement for the prince? Like you had to wait a few weeks for things to die down?
I don't know.
We have a question about, well, again, this brings back the structural question of would a CEO or a CFO be fired if they didn't maximize profits? And I raise it again because another audience member says, what does it say about the international community that we can't seem to come to some conclusion around things being legal but not necessarily ethical? And, well, there is first the question, should legality be the sole rule in business? Is ethics somehow apart from legality, and does that need its own context? And is a company that doesn't push the edge of the law a poorly run company or a company unfair to its shareholders?
So a couple of things. It's kind of investigative journalism. I sometimes see it as it's like a mirror that kind of like contrasts the society in which we live with the society in which we want to live. And we want ethics to be part of the way that businesses are run. I don't know, it's too idealistic or naive to say that. So yes, we want ethical considerations to be part of the equation on how a business is run. The other thing is that one thing is to maximize or minimize taxes in the way that we may all take advantage of certain legal provisions of, oh, okay, if I am paying a mortgage, then I can have a deduction. That's not what we're seeing here. We're not seeing, that would be kind of like normal, legal. We're seeing aggressive, deceitful, completely outrageous matching of jurisdictions, exploitation of loopholes in a way that is just mind-blowing. When you see it, you see the charts.
Can you give me an example?
Yes, it's using, for example, it's like sending. Let me just. You are Nike, and the most valuable thing you have is not the shoes themselves, which are probably made in China or somewhere else, and they are cheap. Is the, I never know how to pronounce it, the swoosh, the trademark, right?
You got it.
And so what they my friend helped me here before, and what they do with the swoosh is they say, okay, this is what gives us the real money. This is where the profits come from, because everybody wants to have, that status. That's what you buy when you buy Nike. And so they stash that trademark, the intellectual property in a tax haven. And so every time you buy a Nike, the majority of the money, which is what you are paying, is the swoosh, it goes to the tax haven.
Can you say swoosh again?
Swoosh.
Thank you.
The last time.
That lazy apostrophe, that sideways comma, is somehow given a value, and the money, there's some portion of the shoe money that is that sideways comma, and that just leaves for...
It leaves the country. In this case, it was European countries, and it gets shifted in the form of loans or other forms of profit shifting. There are countless. That's what the accountants help them do, come up with the next, creative accounting trick.
Just do it.
And then the point is that it just gets there, and it just sits in a zero tax jurisdiction. So the shoe was sold in Germany, but no taxes are ever paid in Germany because the profits are all shifted to Bermuda.
We have a question about the net neutrality rules and the throttling of speeds. Do you expect any limitations or other effects from the U.S. putting in net neutrality rules and your ability to receive information? Since you are an international organization, why don't we take that a little further, because people could shift the data wherever they like and dump it from elsewhere. And eventually you can move even 2 terabytes of data if you must. But do you worry about surveillance or throttling or people slowing you down in order to see what you're receiving or to judge how you're receiving things? And do you take steps in terms of moving your caching around?
We do worry about surveillance, and we have very strict security protocols at ICIJ. Right now, for example, like everybody who works with ICIJ, for example, must use encryption. Reporters who don't want to do it, then they just can't work with us. We don't talk about this in open email. Our platforms are encrypted. So we try to take all the measures we can. We know that there's no system that is perfect. What we do is we always ask ourselves, who do we think is watching? And then the second question is, how much do we care? Because our model of collaboration requires that we take some risks, right? Otherwise, we would be working in a room with a lot of passcodes and no internet in a completely airtight computer. And that's how people are working on the Snowden files. And that makes sense because it's national security. But the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, is not national security. And so you have the question, what is more important, to have this kind of completely airtight security and then nobody can access it except two big organizations who can send reporters to this room from some period of time? Or even if the NSA is watching, which we hope they aren't, and we hope we're taking all the necessary steps to prevent that, do we care? Can they interrupt or slow us down in a significant way? And isn't it more important to make this information available in a secure way as possible to as many journalists around the world as possible?
Now, as we come towards the close of our program, we need a commercial break. If anyone in the audience has 2 terabytes of incriminating or otherwise embarrassing financial data, and I include the radio audience in this, how can they leak it to you?
Well, please go to ICIJ.org, and there's a very prominent button called Leak to Us, and there's there's a lot of really easy to understand, step-by-step and multiple options through Signal and through Secure Drop, which is another system we use, where you can learn and you can get in touch, and we guarantee the anonymity, of course, of the leak and the protection as much as we can. You
too can be John Doe.
You too can be John Doe. And also ICIJ is a non-profit organization. As I said before, we are, for the past year, we have been an independent organization. We separated from our parent company. And so we receive and we appreciate and very grateful for donations and support of any size. Every week we get checks for as little as like $3 or $5, accompanied by wonderful and encouraging notes, and bigger than that as well, thankfully. So any contributions are appreciated, and please share that with people you know who might want to support. And this is priceless work, I think. It's not cheap. It's not cheap because of the technology and the editing and the fact-checking. If we want to continue being as rigorous as we are, we need to invest in it. And so I encourage you to support us.
Now, you've had some fantastic learning experiences in your life. What has, as you reflect on this one, what has it taught you about transparency, about the world we live in, about where the world is going?
It has given me an even greater appreciation for the role of investigative reporters and the role of the media. We as journalists, we're not infallible. We make mistakes. But I also see that there's a whole class of investigative reporters, not only here in the US, but around the world, that is blossoming. I always say that this is a gold age for investigative reporting. First of all, because the world is as complex and difficult as it has ever been, but also because, believe it or not, in this time and age, there's a lot of really aggressive, thoughtful, and idealistic new generation of investigative journalists using technology and using traditional methods to find stories of public interest and bring about transparency to our society. So I encourage you to read those stories, to support those journalists, and to trust in the work they're doing.
It sounds like this has actually made you optimistic.
Very optimistic. I'm completely, I think this is the best time we've ever had to be an investigative journalist, and I'm excited to be part of that.
I congratulate you. And that's all the time we have for tonight. On behalf of World Affairs, I ask you to join me in thanking Marina Walker-Guevara for this excellent discussion. Thanks to all of you, the audience, for your terrific questions.